Senator Barbara Ann Mikulski speaks before a large wooden podium. Figure 8. 1. Barbara Mikulski was the first woman to be elected to the United States Senate during a regular election cycle. She served in the U.S. Senate for 30 years. Credit: Goddard Congressional Visit by NASA/Goddard Space Flight Center Bill H. Rybick/Flickr, CC by 20. Chapter Outline. 8. 1. What is an interest group? 8.2. What are the pros and cons of interest groups? 8.3. Political parties. 8.4. What are the limits of parties? 8.5. What are elections and who participates? 8.6. How do people participate in elections? In 1985, 25 women decided to raise money to elect Democratic women to the United States Congress. A year later, in 1986, Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland became the first female senator to win a seat not by appointment, but in her own right during a regular election cycle. Figure 8.1. Mikulski's historic win was thanks in part to the efforts of those 25 women, who met and started a political interest group and PAC called EMILY's List. 1. The name, which stands for early money is like yeast, it makes the dough rise, was a nod to the understanding that in order to be effective in elections and in politics, people need to pool their interests, activities, and resources. EMILY's List continues to advocate for Democratic women who are running for office and encourages its members to raise money for electoral contests. EMILY's List is just one example of the interwoven relationship between interest groups, political parties, and elections. This chapter will explore the role of interest groups in politics, their pros and cons, how political parties mobilize their own organizational agendas, and how these group-level activities intersect with political elections. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define interest group, discuss types of interest groups, explain and differentiate among different theories about how and why interest groups form, explain and differentiate among different theories about how and why interest groups influence government. In the early 1980s, at the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in America, government response to the increasing need for medical research and assistance to HIV/AIDS patients was scant. In the absence of a federal or state-run public health response, public interest advocacy groups, such as the Gay Men's Health Project, provided services for AIDS patients, gathering donations for food and securing shelter for those afflicted by the disease. Almost a decade later, with still no public health response from the federal government, a group named the Lavender Hill Mob vocally criticized the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's handling of the epidemic, storming the agency's planned convention on the epidemic and demanding research into drugs and treatment. Soon other groups such as ACT-UP formed, calling on the government to respond to the need for more public education to prevent the disease and more resources for further research into ending it. 2. President Ronald Reagan ultimately created the Presidential Commission on the HIV epidemic in 1987 in response to citizen activism and public calls for governmental involvement. The history of group mobilization around HIV/AIDS illustrates how interest groups can harness the cooperation and collaboration of individuals in pursuit of a common goal, but also how multiple groups can work in concert to pressure the government to act. A large street demonstration protests the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Several protesters hold a banner that reads, ACT-UP Shreveport AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Figure 8. 2. ACT-UP protests the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Credit: modification of ACT-UP demonstration at NIH by NIH History Office/Flickr, public domain. Interest groups are groups of people who organize in order to seek to influence a political outcome or seek to alter public policies on the basis of a common interest or concern. The universe of interest groups is as vast in number as it is in scope. For example, in the United States, AARP has nearly 38 million members and advocates on behalf of Americans aged 50 and older on issues such as drug prices, health insurance, taxes, and retirement. 3. An example of a much smaller interest group is the San Francisco Democratic Party, which has 250,000 members and seeks to engage, inform, and mobilize San Francisco Democrats. 4 interest groups are not unique to American politics. In Britain, UK Youth is a group, founded in 1911, that works with 4,000 youth organizations and reaches 4 million youths, lobbying for investment in a variety of youth-oriented leadership, skill acquisition, and health and wellness programs. 5. The French organization La Quadrature du Net works for a free, decentralized, and empowering internet. 6. And was part of a complaint filed against Amazon in Europe that led to an $888 million fine against the internet commerce site for violation of customer privacy and data protection measures. 7. Types of interest groups. Interest groups can be organized into 2 general categories: economic groups and public interest, or non-economic groups. Economic groups focus on issues such as wages, industry protections, job creation, and profit maximization, to name a few, and can be further sorted into subcategories such as business, labor, agricultural, and professional. For example, the United States Chamber of Commerce is a business group that describes itself as the world's largest business organization, representing companies of all sizes and advocating for policies that help create jobs and grow the economy. 8. In Canada, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses lobbies for lower tax rates on small businesses and credit card rate reductions, among other issues. 9 other types of economic groups include labor groups like the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. 10, which represents the interests of workers in healthcare, public services, and property services. In Germany, which has a long history of labor groups in politics, the German Trade Union Confederation, DGB Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund, acts as an umbrella organization for 8 labor groups and represents the interests of close to 6 million German workers. It is the largest labor group in Germany and one of the largest trade organizations in the world. 11. Interest groups like the Irish Farmers Association 12, which works on behalf of agricultural workers in Ireland, are referred to as agricultural groups. In the United States, the National Farmers Union has worked with Congress to make school lunches permanent and to increase country of origin labeling protocols, to name a few of their policy initiatives. 13 other types of interest groups include professional groups like the American Medical Association AMA. 14, which promotes the interests of working medical professionals, such as surgeons and physicians in the United States. And the Japan Medical Association, 15, which, with 170,000 members, is considered the largest and most politically powerful medical lobby in Japan. Non-economic groups do not organize themselves around economic or business-oriented purposes, instead working to advance non-economic issues such as the environment or education. One example is Greenpeace International, an umbrella organization representing Greenpeace offices in 27 regions and 55 countries that all work together to promote environmental protections. 16 varieties of non-economic groups include public interest groups, single-issue groups, civil rights groups, and ideological groups. The Trust for Public Land, a registered nonprofit that creates public parks and preserves outdoor spaces for public use, can be considered a public interest group. 17. The Toronto Public Space Committee, another public interest group, advocates for ecologically responsible, advertisement-free public spaces in Toronto. 18. As their name suggests, single-issue groups champion solitary policies or issues. The Japan Rice Millers Association focuses on just that, the milled rice industry. Founded in 1969, it promotes the interest of rice producers in Japan and advocates for government assistance in ensuring increased production and distribution. 19 groups, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, 20, and the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, CAP 21, are civil rights groups that work to champion the rights of specific minority groups. Because the tenets of democratic socialism drive its work and focus, the Democratic Socialists of America is considered an ideological group. Another example of an ideological group was the Civil Human Rights Front, a pro-democracy group in Hong Kong that protested for democratic representation and voting rights in Hong Kong. Members of the Civil Human Rights Front were arrested and prosecuted by the Beijing government, which claims that pro-democracy protesters are inciting violence. 22. In the face of an intensified crackdown on dissent, the group was forced to disband in August 2021. 23. A group of people stand at the edge of a lake wearing long ponchos, woven with First Nation symbols. They watch as Ayan Chut, Sean Atleo, returns to shore in a canoe. Figure 8. 3. The Assembly of First Nations works to protect and advance the rights and interests of First Nations people in Canada. In this photo, Ayan Chut, Sean Atleo, hereditary chief of the Ahousaht First Nation, returns to his home village on July 31, 2009, after being elected Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Credit, Ayan Chut, Sean Atleo, returns to his home village of Ahousaht by Equitrust Canada/Flickr, CC by 20. Theories of interest group formation. How and why do interest groups, such as the NAACP or La Quadrature du Net form? 3 major theories about interest group formation allow us to better understand how interest groups form and how they function within the political sphere. The first of these, pluralist theory, posits that multiple and diverse interests compete for attention and resources, and that political power is distributed amongst these various interests. Competition among interests allows for the representation of a diversity of views rather than solely those of elite interests, and it prevents single issues from dominating public discourse. In other words, individual interests can be advanced through collective action. 24 e.g., you and I both want more open spaces in the city. Let's get together and advocate. And multiple groups compete for attention to promote change. Thus, according to pluralist theory, interest groups form as a means for individuals to engage in collective action in support of common goals. Columbia University professor David Truman's work on disturbance theory suggests that interest groups form in response to the changing complexity of government and society. In other words, external factors or disturbances cause people to form new groups. These factors can be changes in social norms, environmental factors, or changes in technology. 25, for example, 50 years ago, the idea of legalizing marijuana was unthinkable. As social and medical norms around the use of cannabis have changed, groups such as NORML, the Marijuana Policy Project, and the Drug Policy Alliance have formed to promote the legal use of marijuana in a controlled market and to reduce the harms of both drug use and drug prohibition. 26. As global climate change continues to make media headlines, newer and more radical groups also continue to form, such as Britain's Extinction Rebellion, which engaged in the biggest act of peaceful civil disobedience seen in London for decades. 27. The third major theory, transaction theory, refutes the idea of pluralism. In an exchange theory of interest groups, renowned political scientist Robert H. Salisbury argues that political actors are not influenced by groups that have mobilized to enact change so much as they are responding to the interests of narrowly focused elites, and that the relationship between interest groups and government is that of an exchange. 28. As University of Maryland professor Manker Olson has argued, this idea rests on the notion that, because of the idea of collective goods and the free rider problem, individuals will not exert extra energy to mobilize into groups. 29. In other words, while an interest group works to provide its members with collective goods or services that all members can share, there is no incentive for all members to work for those goods. Free riders gain the benefits of membership without action, learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the pros and cons of interest groups, discuss the role interest groups play in government, explain how interest group activity is regulated. The next time you go to a restaurant, look at your waitstaff. They could be making less than minimum wage or what is called a subminimum wage of $2.13. This is due to the assumption that diners will leave a 15 to 20% tip that will add to their pay. It doesn't take a calculator or a genius to see how unstable this wage is. Some diners simply don't tip, and tip distribution varies from restaurant to restaurant. While front-of-house workers, people who primarily work with diners, might receive an equal share from a pooled tip at the end of the evening, what about line cooks or dishwashers? What if you are a server who provides excellent service? Why should you split your tip with someone who barely bothered to say hello to their customers? The advocacy group One Fair Wage points out that the restaurant industry is the fastest growing sector of the economy, but the lowest paying and that sub-minimum wage practices disproportionately hurt women and minority workers. 30. During the global COVID-19 pandemic, One Fair Wage was quick to point out how the virus obliterated income for these workers, and how, in order to protect the industry, the workers also needed protections. The group continues to advocate for strict health and safety measures for restaurant workers. Pros of interest groups. Interest group participation in politics has its benefits. In Federalist Paper No. 10, James Madison argued that while the threat of factions exists, a healthy representative government will ensure that no single interest monopolizes the government's attention and that competition among interests, pluralism, will ultimately enhance democracy. From this perspective, the model of interest group activity can be seen as an ideal way to serve the common good, because it allows more voices to engage in the political process, which is part and parcel of self-governance. Ultimately, citizen participation in government is essential in part because political actors have difficulty discerning what is important to the public unless the public itself is involved in the process. Interest group activity is one way the people help the government understand which issues are of greatest concern. Additionally, the act of citizen mobilization is thought to produce social capital, whereby relationships forged in political and other social networks help citizens resolve collective problems. Finally, like HIV/AIDS activists in the early 1980s, interest groups can take up issues that are marginalized by traditional political actors. Cons of interest groups. Theoretically, pluralism should work to protect the interests of the many. When multiple interests strive to be heard by governmental actors, multiple interests are also addressed. However, this can bring about problems of factionalism, where small groups of people with shared interests work to have their wishes represented in government despite majority interests. In other words, as Madison addressed in Federalist Paper No. 10, while a multitude of interests may be represented, not all are heard or responded to equally, and a narrow interest may hijack political attention at the expense of the majority's needs. Further, the more socially, monetarily, or institutionally resourced an interest, the more influence it enjoys, regardless of how narrow or seemingly obscure it might be. This latter problem, known as economic bias, is a weakness of the interest group system. As Wesleyan University professor E. Schatznader explains, the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent. 31 groups that represent business or professional interests tend to be better resourced, and though lower-class interests can be represented, interest group membership itself is mostly skewed toward those who make up the upper middle and upper classes, as individuals who make up these groups tend to have more time and resources to commit to this type of political activity. In addition, there is a chicken or egg characteristic in interest group membership in that, as long as upper middle class and upper class interests are represented, these groups naturally attract individuals from these populations and not those in more disadvantaged groups. The theory of interest group liberalism highlights another noted weakness of the interest group system. 32. Instead of a pluralistic ideal, whereby issues important to various groups jostle within the public realm for governmental response, interest group liberalism suggests that officials respond to well-organized groups not because they are good for society, but because well-organized interests simply do a better job of demanding governmental action. Video. What is an interest group? Any group that shares an interest can form an interest group to try to advance their goals. How do interest groups influence government, and how are they regulated? The formal work of interest groups is referred to as lobbying, the attempt by a group to influence a political outcome. Lobbying can take on different forms, and groups often lobby different branches and types of government. Lobbying itself can be further divided into two categories: inside lobbying and outside lobbying. Meet a professional. Andy Chasson, Vice President of Federal Policy and Advocacy for Blue Shield of California. Please explain what you do for your organization. I run federal policy and advocacy for Blue Shield of California, a nonprofit health insurer with more than 4 million members. My job is to provide strategic advice to the company on what's happening in Washington, D.C. I used to work in the Senate on healthcare policy, and now lobby both houses of Congress and work to influence the constant flow of rulemakings coming out of administrative agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services. My company has a political action committee, PAC, that our employees voluntarily support to allow us to attend events with lawmakers. Giving money doesn't mean that a member of Congress will do what you want, but it does often provide an opportunity to share your perspective on important issues. Ultimately, my work is to ensure that healthcare is affordable and accessible for our members, and to urge lawmakers to provide a way to get everyone in America covered in the least disruptive way possible. What did you study in school? I went to law school and studied politics, philosophy, and economics as an undergraduate. What did you learn as an undergraduate that helps you in this position? The ability to write, think critically, and understand the point of view of different stakeholders is something I use every day. Inside lobbying occurs when interest groups cultivate contacts and relationships within government. Examples of inside lobbying include lobbying the legislative branch of government, such as the United States Congress, in order to provide testimony, suggest items for consideration, aid in the crafting of legislation, or mobilize constituents to write their members of Congress to support or vote against certain bills. Interest groups also lobby other parts of government, including the executive branch. They do so by working with federal agencies, executive appointees, and in the case of the United States, even the White House to do much of the same work they do when lobbying Congress. This work includes identifying or introducing specific pieces of legislation that will further their cause, providing information for or writing drafts of policy proposals, and mobilizing constituent support. Groups such as the aforementioned One Fair Wage lobby state and local governments to raise state minimum wages for tipped workers, for example. Interest group lobbying of the judicial system differs from lobbying of other branches because the courts do not write or pass legislation. As such, groups work to influence the judicial branch in other ways. The first is connected to ways groups lobby the other two branches, in that interest groups can try to influence judicial appointments by suggesting possible appointees for the other two branches to nominate and confirm. Interest groups also use amicus curiae, or friend of the court, briefs to lobby the judiciary. Using amicus curiae briefs, groups file official positions to make known to judges and justices their official positions on cases being heard before a court. Depending on the case and the group, interest groups can also use their resources to file cases in lower courts or have appeals heard in higher courts, such as the Supreme Court. A recent example is Sierra Club v. Trump, in which the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, acting on behalf of the Sierra Club and Southern Border Communities Coalition, filed suit against President Trump for his use of executive power to fund and build a wall on the southern border of the United States. 33 in this instance, 3 interest groups joined in a case against the executive branch of the government. 34 the case, which started in a lower district court, was appealed and made it to the Supreme Court, though the case was dismissed after President Biden rescinded Trump's executive order to divert funding for the wall. 35. Interest groups also utilize tactics such as outside lobbying, also known as indirect lobbying or grassroots lobbying, which entails rallying public support in order to pressure political actors to consider their causes. In outside lobbying, groups call upon their own members as well as the general public to take up the mantle of their cause through a show of public support. The movement to recall California Governor Gavin Newsom is an example of this type of grassroots lobbying. 36. The arrest and conviction of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7, a group of activists who entered Kings Bay military facility in the state of Georgia to protest the use of the government's nuclear arsenal, is an example of how protests and radical activism can be considered a more extreme form of grassroots lobbying. 37 members of Extinction Rebellion go to extreme measures, such as gluing themselves to planes in order to call attention to the climate crisis. 38. Inside and outside lobbying can look different in Europe. In Switzerland, for example, ballot initiatives, where constituents vote directly on pieces of legislation, alter how interest groups work. The recall effort of California Governor Newsom is also an example of a ballot initiative. interest groups may be less reliant on policymakers and inside lobbying when they have the option to appeal directly to the public, though studies have shown that the work of lobbying groups tends to be more negative than positive in nature. In other words, instead of lobbying for legislative change, interest groups in Switzerland can act as gatekeepers, working to block laws that are not in the group's interests. 39. In addition to lobbying, interest groups also work to raise and donate funds to directly decide the outcomes of elections. A group's official fundraising arm is called a Political Action Committee, PAC. PACs can accept up to $5,000 from any single individual and can contribute the same amount to a single candidate or $15,000 to a party. PACs, like interest groups, cover all sorts of interests. For example, when you bite into a hard taco or a gordita from Taco Bell, did you know that you could be contributing to a political candidate? Between 2018 and 2020, the Political Action Committee for Taco Bell, called Taco PAC, raised and donated over $100,000 to Republican candidates and $2,500 to Democrats. 40. The PAC describes itself this way. Taco PAC provides a way for individuals to join their contributions and voice with those of other supporters in the quick-serve, franchise restaurant industry, including owners and operators. 41. Taco Bell is not the only fast food franchise to contribute to political candidates. In the same election cycle, Wendy's contributed over $100,000, while McDonald's gave $500,000. 42. PACs, such as Taco PAC, are regulated in how much they can give to candidates and parties, and they are required to fully disclose their donors. Unlike PACs, super PACs are fundraising groups that can raise and spend unlimited funds provided they do not explicitly coordinate with a candidate. In the 2020 election cycle, super PAC spending totaled over $2 billion. 43. Super PAC spending, $2010 $125 million, 2012 $2 billion, 2014 $390 million, 2016 $5 billion, 2018 $822 million, 2022 $1 billion, total $5 billion. Table 8, 1 year-over-year super PAC spending source. Center for Responsive Politics. Super PACs are not without controversy. Also referred to as independent expenditure-only committees, super PACs can raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, and individuals, and then spend the money to campaign for or against candidates or ballot initiatives. The birth of super PACs came about in 2010 as a result of Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission 44, when the Supreme Court ruled that limiting independent political spending from corporations and other groups violates the First Amendment right to free speech. 45 critics of this ruling complain that it has led to the rampant rise of super PACs, which empower the wealthiest donors and receive dark money, which is when super PACs receive donations from shell corporations, companies or corporations that exist only on paper for monetary purposes, and that, while they have no office and no employees, may have bank accounts, or donors who do not disclose their identities. Super PAC and dark money donations have only grown since the Citizens United ruling. Interest groups and their lobbyists, as well as wealthy elites, fuel PAC and super PAC activity. As such, part of regulating interest group activity means monitoring lobbyists and the work they perform, be it inside or outside lobbying. However, the number of lobbyists that work to influence the government is a point of contention. Between 2009 and 2019, the number contracted from roughly 13,000 to around 11,000, but American University professor James Thurber refutes these numbers, explaining that they represent registered lobbyists rather than the entirety of the lobbyist population, which he calculates to be closer to 100,000. 46. The latest attempt to reform lobbying practices, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007, placed tighter restrictions on campaign contributions through PACs and on campaign travel and adjusted definitions of what constitutes a lobbyist. Whether an in-house lobbyist who works within an organization or an outside lobbyist who is hired to represent interest groups. Among other changes, The act included so-called revolving door bans, which require elected officials to wait at least a year after serving in government before joining a lobbying firm, and limited the monetary value of gifts lobbyists can receive. 47. On January 20, 2021, President Biden signed an executive order further strengthening lobbying regulations, pledging an executive branch, revolving door ban of 2 years, and banning golden parachutes, exit bonuses that reward executives leaving private companies upon entering federal government positions, among other restrictions. 48. The United States is not the only government to contend with the ethics of lobbyists. While the EU developed the European Transparency Initiative, ETI, in 2005 to enhance transparency in EU policymaking and boost confidence in decision-making processes, scholars like University of Pittsburgh law professor William Lundberg point out that these regulations are not enforced and require minimal information, who they represent, for example, on the part of the lobbyist. And in countries such as Germany, Georgia, Lithuania, and Poland, lobbyist registration is wholly voluntary and thus lacks teeth in terms of acting as an enforcement measure. 49. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define political party, explain the purpose and activities of political parties, differentiate among different types of political parties and systems. The Scottish National Party, SNP, is Scotland's largest political party. It describes itself as centre-left and social democratic. 50. The SNP supports policies such as expanding government-provided health care and removing Britain's nuclear submarine program off the shores of Scotland, but it is also increasingly associated with a single focus, Scottish independence from Britain. Though a recent panel-based poll indicated that support for Scottish independence has cooled, numbers also illustrate that 70% of Scots under the age of 35 think Scotland should abandon the United Kingdom. 51. After winning 3 consecutive majority terms in Scottish Parliament, current SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon has promised a referendum, an election in which the voters decide whether to overturn existing law or policy on Scottish independence in 2023. Video: What happens if Scotland leaves Britain? This video from The Economist considers the movement for Scottish independence and the potential consequences if it is successful. What are political parties? How do political parties work? Political parties are groups that organize around a shared political ideology, with the primary goal of electing party members to positions in government. Political parties have a lot in common with interest groups. Like interest groups, political parties operate to influence policymakers. However, political parties differ from interest groups in one crucial way. While PACs donate to certain candidates, interest groups ultimately work with any elected official if they feel doing so will meet their policy ends. In contrast, political parties seek to control the government from within by getting as many of their party members elected as possible. Like interest groups, parties form in response to the need for collective action. Their activities allow candidates to reach and mobilize individual voters. Or, as Indiana University professor Marjorie Randon Hershey writes, political parties are a means by which people agree to behave cooperatively over the long term so as to secure benefits that they would not have been able to gain as individuals. 52. Tufts University professor Jeffrey Berry and Georgetown University professor Clyde Wilcox contend that political parties act as counterweights to interest groups, curbing too much external influence over government. 53. Political parties and interest groups can be seen as partners in many of their activities when it comes to getting candidates elected. For example, the Republican Party in the United States has long maintained ties with conservative Christian groups in order to recruit and organize voters, and the election of President Trump was no exception. Some claim that since the 1970s, no Republican candidate could win a nomination for president without the mobilization efforts of religious figures, such as televangelist Jerry Falwell. 54. In the United States, political parties have taken different forms and different names, but the country has steadily maintained a two-party system. However, Japan, one of the oldest democracies in Asia, is an example of a party system where a single dominant party, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, has been in place for decades despite a fully competitive electoral system. 55. This contrasts with China, which has one ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, but has no democratic elections. The changing political landscape. Women in the U.S. Congress. Nancy Pelosi stands before a podium, in front of 6 American flags, speaking into a microphone. Figure 8. For Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, credit, IMG, by Senate Democrats/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Leading up to the general election in 2020, the United States saw a sea change in the makeup of candidates seeking political office, in which almost half of the candidates seeking congressional seats were women, 204 of 435. 56. Considering the adage, "You can't win if you don't run," it is significant that so many female candidates sought elected office, reflecting trends in representation in society in general. Women now make up just over a quarter of the members of the 117th Congress, a record in American history and a 50% increase from a decade ago. 57. Additionally, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is not only the first woman to hold the position, she is the only woman to hold it twice. Central party activities. In addition to working to choose and elect candidates, parties serve other practical functions. Political parties, like interest groups and their PACs, raise money for campaigns. By electing members of their parties to government, parties work to garner a majority coalition in order to direct policy outcomes, and in the United States, money in elections continues to grow. In the 2020 election cycle, both parties raised close to $2 billion to distribute to various candidates and their campaigns. 58. In 2018, the aforementioned Liberal Democratic Party raised $46 billion, or roughly $22 million, to fund campaigns in Japan, despite the assumption that the party would continue to dominate the political system. 59. Parties are instrumental in identifying potential members, and registering new voters is a key component of their work. Because American voters are not automatically registered to vote, and depending on their state of residence, may be required to register with a party in order to vote in a political primary. Political parties shoulder the important burden of finding new voters to participate in elections. While close to half of voters in the United States register to vote in their states when they apply for a driver's license, political parties try to make up the difference by registering as many members to their own parties as they can. In the 2020 election cycle, the Republican Party added close to 150,000 new voters in Florida and 30,000 additional voters in Arizona. 60. However, the gains the party made during the run-up to the election were lost after the Capitol Hill riots on January 6, 2021, with the New York Times reporting that 140,000 members left the Republican Party in the 25 states that have readily available data. 61. The death of George Floyd in early summer of 2020 may have spurred additional Democratic registration throughout several states, including Michigan and Minnesota. 62. However, the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School notes that overall registration pales in comparison to 2016 for both parties in large part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The center found that voter registration decreased by 38% in 17 of 21 states it analyzed. 63. Show me the data. A bar graph of Minnesota voter registration in summer 2020 shows that Democrat registrations outnumbered Republican registrations, and that both Democrat and Republican registrations rose significantly shortly after the May 25th killing of George Floyd. Figure 8. 5. Minnesota voter registration rose in the summer of 2020 in reaction to the murder of George Floyd. Source: https insights targetsmart.com September-15 2020 Democrats voter registration advantage increases in Midwestern states home to protests. HTML attribution copyright Rice University OpenStax under CC by 4. 0 license. Political parties also vet and recruit candidates for election, and a party that cannot nominate candidates is toothless in its power. 64. University of Illinois professor Lester G. Seligman echoed this sentiment, calling candidate recruitment a basic function of a political party. 65. The extent to which parties perform this function varies by country. The United Kingdom is an example of a parliamentary system where parties play an important role in candidate recruitment, with elected officials often cutting their teeth in local government before being considered for a seat in Parliament. 66. In the United States, candidate recruitment is increasingly seen as a responsibility political parties and interest groups share, with the latter taking on more of the gatekeeping role in recent years, thanks to their organizational powers and ability to gather resources and mobilize supporters. 67. Contemporary party systems. Throughout its political history, the United States has had what is considered a two-party system. Over time, the two parties have taken on different forms and names, starting with the Federalists and the Democratic-Republican parties, then the Whigs and the Democrats, and now the Democrats and Republicans. While third parties like the Green Party and Democratic Socialists certainly exist, the United States is considered a two-party system since only two parties have a realistic chance of wielding political control. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party, Tories, and the Labour Party enjoyed long-standing dominance throughout the 20th century. However, the emergence of the Liberal Democrats, Reform UK, or the Brexit Party, and smaller influential parties at the local and regional level has altered the United Kingdom's traditional two-party system, making it look more like a multi-party system. 68. Germany provides another interesting example of a multi-party system. Prior to Adolf Hitler's rise, over a dozen political parties held seats in the German government. After the rise of Nazi Germany, the country became a single-party government, Third Reich, and this single-party structure remained in place from 1933 to 1945, until the end of the Second World War. 69. Germany subsequently broke into two separate countries, East and West Germany. A single party, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, ruled East Germany. During this era, several parties grew in West Germany, including the Christian Democratic Union. And after the reunification of Germany in 1990, Christian Democratic Union Majority Party leader Helmut Kohl led the government. Then, in 2016, the outcome of the German election led to a six-party government, 70 with power sharing between the Social Democrats, Alternative for Germany, AfD, the Christian Democrats, the Left, the Green, and the Free Democrats. Single-party systems still exist today. Though China has multiple registered minority parties, it is considered a single-party system where the Communist Party has controlled all levers of government since its rise to power in 1949. 71. Similarly, Cuba has been a single-party communist state since 1959. 72. Eritrea in Northeast Africa has also been ruled by a single party, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, and a single leader, President Isaias Afwerki, since 1993. 73. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain trends showing the decline of the party system, discuss the weaknesses of the party system in the United States, describe patterns of party decline around the world. Historically, political parties have held considerable power in recruiting candidates, mobilizing voters, and securing funds for nominees. Many Americans' image of party politics involves William Tweed, or Boss Tweed, a 19th-century Democratic Party operative who used corrupt methods to exert power and influence within New York City politics. He remains a significant figure in American political history as an example of the height of both the potential corruption and power of the party system, a system that some argue has begun its descent in terms of its ability to fulfill its basic roles. The decline of parties and the rise of candidate-centered campaigns in the United States. What is the current state of political parties? University of California Professor Martin Wattenberg and Harvard University Professor Thomas E. Patterson argue that since the late 1980s, the United States has seen a rise in what is called the candidate-centered campaign. This is the idea that the declining influence of political parties and their decreased ability to mobilize voters' opinions and actions has set voters politically adrift, and that candidates themselves have stepped in to fill the power vacuum. 74. These types of entrepreneurial, candidates further weaken party influence, in that they do not need to depend on the party for resources in order to launch a campaign or reach voters. 75. There is no better example of a candidate-centered campaign than that of Ross Perot, a self-made billionaire who funded his own run for president as a third-party candidate against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in 1992. 76. Perot did not win the election, but he managed to take 20% of the popular vote. Yale University professor Ian Shapiro bemoans this trend in candidate-centered campaigns and the weakening party system. According to Yale News reporter Mike Cummings, the transfer of political power to the grassroots has eroded trust in politicians, parties, and democratic institutions, culminating in the rise of divisive, populist politics in the United States and abroad. 77. Former President Donald J. Trump is also an example of a candidate who ran outside of the traditional Republican Party platform, who was able to garner media attention despite his inexperience with politics, and who very much manifested this idea of the candidate-centered campaign. On a stage with two podiums, Bill Clinton shakes Ross Perot's hand while George H.W. Bush looks on. Figure 8. 6. Ross Perot, right, shown here with Presidents Bill Clinton, left, and George H.W. Bush, center, was a third-party candidate for president in 1992. Credit: P3716112 by George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum, public domain. The decline of political parties around the world. Political parties have weakened not just in the United States, but across the globe. European University Institute Professor Peter Mayer and Leiden University Professor Ingrid van Biezen found both that levels of party membership have declined as a proportion of the electorate, and that there has been a major decline in the absolute numbers of party members across all the long-established European democracies. 78. University of Essex professor Paul Whiteley likewise describes a well-documented, long-term decline in party activism across Europe, and attributes this trend to parties being too close to the state and no longer working to recruit and rely on membership for their work. 79. Other reasons for the global decline of parties include the rise of candidate-centered campaigns, as in the United States, economic factors like deindustrialization, and the rise of communications technologies as an alternative to traditional groups. 80. The declining salience of class as an identity in political mobilization is also a factor in the decline in party identification, as seen in the United States and in countries like France and Britain, where left-wing parties have seen a decline in working-class voters. In all three countries, voters with low incomes and lower levels of education had tended to support left-of-center parties, while high-income, highly educated voters had aligned with those of the right. However, as London School of Economics and School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences Professor Thomas Piketty has pointed out, this is no longer the case. Party alliance has flipped. Those with higher education and income levels tend to be more liberal and support candidates on the left, while working-class and less educated voters support conservative policies. 81. The outgrowth of this trend has, according to Piketty, also led to a rise in populism, or the appeal on the part of public leaders to the belief by ordinary people that established elite groups disregard their concerns. 82. In countries such as Venezuela and Peru, the collapse of the party system is attributed to a myriad of causes including, but not limited to, corruption, lowered party identification, weakened party organizations, and ideological underrepresentation. 83. Seawright notes that in the case of Venezuela, traditional parties dominated politics throughout the 1980s before losing power in the 1990s, and culminating in the rise of Hugo Chavez, a charismatic, populist leader who took the country from moderate U.S. ally to confrontational populist leftism. 84. Similar party weakening has occurred in Indonesia. While party coalitions were meant to facilitate cooperation among different parties, the party system in Indonesia was ultimately weakened by its reliance on patronage, giving government jobs to family and supporters. An institutional failing that academics suggest led to the rise of populist leaders such as President Joko Widodo. 85. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define the term election, explain why elections are important to democracy and popular participation, describe some weaknesses of popular elections, discuss who votes in elections. Elections take many forms, from student body elections, where a group of peers elect one of their own to represent their interests within their school, to a national election that selects a country's president. An election is a formal decision-making process in which groups determine which individuals will hold public office. In certain states and countries, elections are a means for citizens to select among policy preferences. As Rutgers University professor Gerald Pomper writes, elections are a positive means by which groups can seek particular goals. 86. Why are elections important to representative democracy? Frequent elections are a hallmark of any representative democracy because they allow elected members of government to understand the will of the people, and they give people the opportunity to select these representatives and policies based on their preferences. From an American perspective, as Madison writes in Federalist Paper No. 52, frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. 87. In other words, if voters are expected to depend upon and trust their representatives, frequent elections are necessary to ensure the government understands the electorate's needs. Elections can also be seen as competitions where interest groups and political parties use their resources to convince groups of voters to vote for certain candidates over others. 88. The competitive nature of elections allows voters to comparison shop and forces candidates to be open about their objectives and plans. Competitive elections encourage voters to make electoral decisions, and these collective decisions should work to move elected officials in one direction over another in order to maintain their roles. What can I do? Social responsibility and elections. I voted sticker in 13 different languages. Figure 8. 7. I voted sticker credit. I voted by the Marmot/Flickr CC by. As students of political science, we are often challenged with explaining how the various fields, theories, and topics we study can translate into something tangibly relevant to the world outside of political science. This link is particularly clear when studying elections, since elections give us the opportunity to directly take part in the democratic process through a particular form of civic engagement. Voting. Voting, however, is not the only form of civic engagement related to elections. Individuals can also volunteer to work at the polls on election day. They can work to help register voters, and they can also volunteer to support the campaign of a preferred candidate. By participating in elections, we each have a chance to have our own voice heard within the halls of power through the selection of elected officials, as well as voting on referenda and constitutional amendments. Each of us should strive to understand the role we play in our own community, how our communities intersect with other communities, and the importance of engaging in the civic life of all levels of government. What are some problems with elections? Elections are not without their problems. In economics, the theory of adverse selection refers to the idea that sellers, not buyers, have the upper hand when it comes to information, especially when it comes to product quality. For example, when a family goes to a shelter to select a puppy, they tend to know relatively little about the puppy's lineage, what kind of environment it was born or raised in, and what the puppy is like day to day. The family has only limited information to help them decide which puppy to select, much as limited information impairs voters' ability to make choices about policies and candidates. For example, a recent ballot initiative in California asked voters to decide if drivers of rideshare services such as Uber and Lyft are employees or contractors. The two companies spent $205 million to persuade voters to exempt them from treating their drivers as workers. 89. Since voters cannot fully educate themselves on everything they must vote on, the information asymmetry can often benefit the candidate, or, in this case, the companies that can spend the most on communicating with potential voters. This example also sheds light on the problematic costs of elections. As mentioned, the last presidential election cost $14 billion, all to persuade voters to cast a ballot a certain way. As we will discuss later in the chapter, how and when elections occur varies around the world, but the high cost of elections is a uniquely American problem. Elections also shed light on the problems of moral hazard. In terms of elections, a moral hazard is the risk a voter takes that a chosen candidate may not, once elected, act in the way the voter hopes, or as Pomper notes, elections have been held harmful because they actually promote the unqualified. In this way, voting is an act of faith and one that may bring you, the voter, risk or disappointment down the road, particularly if a voter decides to take a chance on a candidate without experience or a candidate who performs well in an election but is not necessarily equipped to govern. Voters may consciously or subconsciously react to the problems of adverse selection and moral hazards by not voting at all. Voter suppression is defined as election practices or policies that discourage or prevent specific groups of people from voting, and is another problem voters face in elections around the globe. For example, 17 million EU citizens live and work in another EU country. Yet, voting patterns in Italy, Hungary, Poland, and Greece show the extent to which EU expatriates' political rights have been eroded. Illiberal ruling parties know that these diaspora groups could hurt them electorally and avoid encouraging, or have taken steps actively to discourage, their political participation. The United States has a regrettable history with voter suppression, as illustrated with Jim Crow laws in the South that barred minorities from voting through the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and mass purges of Black voters from registration lists. States continue to engage in voter suppression, and the Brennan Center for Justice reports that between January and May of 2021, 14 states enacted 22 new laws that restrict access to the polls, including restrictions on mail-in ballots, making mail-in ballot deadlines earlier, and making voter ID laws stricter. 91 opponents of these laws explain that minorities are often the targets of such laws, as they do not have the time or resources to fulfill the necessary voter ID requirements or onerous time deadlines imposed by such laws. Voter suppression has been cited as a cause for lower turnout among minorities in states that enact these regulations. Who participates in elections? The number of eligible voters who cast a ballot in an election is referred to as voter turnout. Note that there is a difference between eligible voters and registered voters. In the United States, the voting eligible population, VEP, is all citizens who have reached the minimum age to vote, regardless of registration status, excluding people who are not eligible to vote, such as non-citizens and, in certain states, convicted felons. Registered voters, on the other hand, are voters who have reached the legal voting age, have their names on a voter registration list, and meet the requirements set by their state or jurisdiction in order to vote. The number of registered voters in the United States is lower than the number of eligible voters, and the number of registered voters who actually vote is lower still. The number of adults who participated in elections in the United States in the last 20 years hovered between a low of 52% and a high of 66% in the 2020 presidential election. 92 America has low voter turnout relative to other democratic countries, ranking 30th out of 35 OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries. 93. Show me the data. A bar graph compares turnout of eligible voters in recent elections in 10 industrialized democracies. Sweden recorded the highest turnout at 82.1%, the United Kingdom recorded the lowest at 62.3%, and the United States recorded 65%. Figure 8. 8 country-by-country comparison of voter turnout, source, Pew Research and Global News Reports, attribution, copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Who votes in American elections? In short, wealthy, older, educated whites are the most likely demographic group to turn out to vote, while Asians, Hispanic Americans, those with less than a high school degree, and voters under the age of 24 have among the lowest turnout rates. Though the number of eligible voters has grown throughout the nation's history, the disparity among groups still exists for many reasons. Show me the data. A bar graph shows recent voting trends in the U.S. by demographic group. Most years, turnout has been highest among non-Hispanic whites and lowest among non-Hispanic Asians and Hispanics. Turnout was highest overall in 2020, except among non-Hispanic Blacks, who turned out in large numbers for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. Figure 8. 9 Voting in the United States by demographic group. Source: U.S. Census Bureau, Current Population Survey, November Supplement 2008 to 2020. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. In his seminal work on voter participation, University of California professor Aaron Leifart provides insights into the multiplicity of reasons for low voter turnout in the United States. These include the frequency of elections, off-year elections, holding elections on weekdays, and voter registration rules. 94 The frequency of elections leads to what some call voter fatigue, whereby the demands of multiple elections leave voters feeling apathetic or disengaged. With presidential elections every 4 years, congressional elections every 2 years, plus a multitude of local, state, and special elections, Americans face too many choices too many times. Subsequent studies have supported the claim that the frequency of elections depressed voter turnout in other countries as well. 95 In the United States, there is also a marked drop-off in participation during off-year elections, when there is no presidential race, only state and local races. Election frequency is also posited as the reason for low voter turnout in Switzerland, which at roughly 40% turnout and despite compulsory voting, has one of the lowest percentages of voting-eligible people in a developed country who cast ballots in a national election. 96 Some suggest that an election day holiday, where voting day is a national holiday or voters vote on a weekend, would boost turnout in the United States. Typically, U.S. elections are held during the week, when most people have work or school commitments, whereas countries such as Japan vote on Sundays. The set of conditions voters must meet and be able to prove in order to be eligible to vote, known as voter registration requirements, are also often cited as a reason for low voter participation in the United States. Unlike in other countries, such as Japan, China, and most of Europe and South America, where voter registration is automatic, voter registration is not compulsory in the United States. Many argue that leaving the onus of registration on the voter prevents easy access to the polls. Voter registration requirements also vary widely across states. 21 states allow individuals to register and vote on the same day, while 5 states have automatic voter registration systems. The remaining states require voters to register anywhere between a week and 30 days prior to the election. 97. In addition to institutional barriers, there are other explanations for why people do not vote, including declines in social capital and trust of government. Communities with higher social capital, or relationships forged in political and other social networks that help citizens resolve collective problems, enjoy lower levels of crime and higher levels of trust in government. 98 Higher levels of social capital are also associated with the willingness to vote. Researchers argue that encouraging individuals to join groups leads to increased community involvement and thus civic participation. 99, and this has been shown in studies of Italy. 100, as well as multiple democratic countries. 101, as levels of trust in the government have fallen, participation has fallen, and the perception of the lack of integrity in the electoral system has also been correlated with lower turnout. Show me the data. A line graph shows changing levels of trust in government among U.S. adults since 1958. Trust dropped sharply from a high of 77% in 1964 to a low of 27% in 1980, rebounded off and on in the 1980s and 1990s, rose to 54% in 2000, and has dropped and hovered between 15% and 20% since. Figure 8. 10 Changing levels of trust in government among U.S. adults. Source: Survey of U.S. adults conducted July 27 Aug. 2, 2020. Trend sources: Pew Research Center's American Trends Panel, 2020. Pew Research Center phone surveys, 2019 and earlier. National Election Studies, Gallup, ABC Washington Post, CBS New York Times, and CNN polls. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Learning outcomes: By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how elections take place in the United States and abroad. Describe the regulations that govern elections in the United States and abroad. Compare United States elections and regulations with those in other countries. On October 8, 2004, against the backdrop of extremists' threat, difficult terrain, and sometimes adverse weather conditions, Afghanistan's first-ever democratic presidential election took place. 102, despite public warnings from a former Taliban supreme leader who threatened violent attacks, should citizens vote in the first-ever direct democracy election in Afghanistan. Afghan politician Hamid Karzai was elected out of 17 presidential candidates. 103, roughly a month later, on November 3, Karzai was officially elected president with 55.4% of the vote. 104 in a region U.S. military forces had occupied after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The election of Karzai was an incredible achievement, and perhaps most significantly, the election, contrary to expectations, was not marred by ethnic, ideological, and linguistic cleavages so characteristic of the Afghan society. Karzai's government will be better advised to facilitate the creation of a balanced party system in Afghanistan. 105 global media carried pictures of jubilant Afghans, their thumbs stained with purple ink that signified they had voted, and these pictures reminded all of us how important elections are in a democracy. A veiled woman shows ink on her finger indicating that she has voted. Figure 8. 11 ink on a finger symbolizes that a vote has been cast. Credit: DSC 91, courtesy, USAID ISAF Public Affairs /Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Electoral districts and plurality and proportional representation. In the United States, Americans vote in what are called electoral districts, which are all roughly equal in size in terms of population. The United States House of Representatives, state legislatures, and local governments all have their own districts from which a single representative is elected, though this was not always the case. At the writing of the Constitution, Article I, Section 4 simply stated that both Congress and state legislatures would determine how elections for members of Congress would occur. Congress first passed the law dictating that House members be elected by district in 1842, and by 1872 they had expanded its scope, articulating the need for equal districts. 106. In the case of the United States Senate, each state is the equivalent of a district, though each state obviously has a different number of residents. When the Constitution was drafted, state legislatures elected senators. But by 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed and ratified in order to allow the election of senators by direct popular vote. 107. The President of the United States is elected through the Electoral College, a system of electors the number of which is equal to the total number of senators, 2 from each state, and House members, plus electors from Washington, D.C. 108. Each state is a district. States choose electors using different methods including state conventions, state party central committees, appointment by state governors, state primary, or nomination by the party's candidate. Electors are expected to vote on behalf of their party and according to the popular vote. However, as we have seen in recent elections, the winner of the popular vote is not always the winner of the Electoral College. 109. This is because, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska, states utilize a winner-take-all approach to allocating electoral votes. This means that no matter the margin, the candidate who wins the popular vote in a state wins all of that state's electoral college votes. Maine and Nebraska allocate one electoral vote to each of their congressional districts, and the winner of each of those districts is awarded one electoral vote. The winner of the statewide vote is then awarded the state's remaining 2 electoral votes. This allocation of electoral college votes is referred to as the congressional district method. Most American elections are won by plurality rule, whereby the candidate with the most votes wins. Some states, such as Georgia, require candidates for statewide office to win at least 50% of the vote, which is called majority rule. If a candidate cannot secure 50% of the vote, the election goes into what is called a runoff election, where the field of candidates is whittled down to a smaller number and the election is held again. Georgia Senate candidates Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff stand at either side of Chuck Schumer, who speaks before a podium emblazoned with the seal of the U.S. Senate. Figure 8. 12 Georgia Senate candidates Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff stand at either side of Senator Chuck Schumer. Credit: Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, DNY, Senator Jon Ossoff, DGA, and Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, DGA, by Senate Democrats/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. The main alternative to plurality rule is proportional representation, a concept that is often suggested as an alternative to the winner-take-all approach of the Electoral College. In proportional representation, the proportional breakdown of votes cast by the electorate for each party determines what proportion of the governing body is made up of members of those parties. In other words, if one party were to win 60% of the vote and another party were to win 40%, the government would consist of 60% of the first party and 40% of the other. Notably, America does not employ proportional representation at any level of elections, and according to Duverger's law, this is the reason why the United States also still has only two main parties. Plurality rule encourages a dichotomous party system, whereas proportional representation encourages multiple parties to form. 110. Not all countries have the same type of elections. While the United States has a president who is elected indirectly by an electoral college and a legislature that is bicameral and directly elected, Japan, for example, has a directly elected national diet parliament made up of the House of Representatives and the House of Councilors. In the House of Representatives, the larger legislative body, the majority of members are elected by plurality vote in single-member constituencies to serve 4-year terms, while some members are elected through a closed-list proportional representation system, whereby voters can pick a party but not individual candidates. 111. In elections for the House of Councilors, voters mark their preferences for both a candidate and a party, and members are elected through an open-list proportional representation system. The head of state is the Prime Minister, who is appointed by the Diet. Japan is considered a long-running and stable democracy with regular elections determined by popular vote. However, not all countries have completely free and fair elections. Thailand, for example, has a bicameral legislature, but the entirety of the Senate is appointed by the military, while the Prime Minister is appointed by the King. The House of Representatives are elected by a plurality vote through a closed-list proportional representation system. North Korea is the most drastic case of a controlled election. Voting for the Supreme People's Assembly, SPA, is compulsory, and people have no choice of candidates. Direct democracy, ballot initiatives and referendums. Ballot initiatives and referendums are examples of a different type of election, often referred to as direct democracy, where instead of elected representatives deliberating upon policies, citizens vote on those policies directly. A ballot initiative introduces a new piece of legislation or a law, e.g., whether Maryland should allow gambling in all counties, while a referendum asks voters to support or terminate an already existing law or policy. A recall is a type of direct democracy that provides voters with the opportunity to end the term of an already elected member of government. California Governor Gavin Newsom speaks into a handheld microphone as constituents hold up signs in the background that read, "Vote No" on Prop 8. Figure 8. 13. In 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom survived a recall election that would have removed him from office. Credit: IMG 1974 by Charlie Nguyen/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. These types of direct democracy are present in 26 U.S. states and multiple local municipalities, 10 EU countries, and Taiwan. 112. Direct democracy is often lauded as fully representing the will of the people, but ballot initiatives, referendums, and recalls are also criticized for their costs and lack of deliberation. Election regulations in the United States. In the United States, the federal government plays only a limited role in regulating campaigns and elections. This is due in part to the idea behind the federal system of American government, which balances power between the federal government and the states. As such, states are free to oversee their own election processes so long as they do not violate existing federal laws or state statutes. For example, since 1998, Oregon has used mail-in ballots, where all registered voters receive ballots 3 weeks before Election Day. 113 in Maine, voters are allowed to use a ranked choice method to select candidates, with the lowest-ranked candidates eliminated in each round until there are only 2 candidates left. The candidate who wins more than 50% of the vote in the final round is declared the winner. 114 states also differ in other methods and regulations around voting. For example, recent proposed changes in the Georgia legislature would make Sunday voting more difficult for Georgians wishing to cast early votes. This type of regulation is decided at the state level, though opponents allege that this measure is aimed squarely at minimizing Black turnout since, historically, Southern churches have encouraged their congregants to vote on Sundays. 115. While state election commissions and agencies largely set their own parameters around when, where, and how people can vote, the federal government is primarily concerned with supporting states in administering elections and with campaign finance. That is, with limiting the amount of money that flows into and out of campaigns. More specifically, congressional agencies are tasked with regulating or overseeing campaign finance, election administration, election security, redistricting, qualifications and contested elections, and voting rights, though the primary role of administering elections is left to the states and their jurisdictions, reflecting the American tenets of federalism. While the Election Assistance Commission and Federal Election Commission are 2 federal agencies devoted to overseeing campaigns and elections, the Justice Department administers and enforces some election statutes. The Department of Homeland Security is also now more involved with elections. 116. Where can I engage? Working the polls. Poll workers are sometimes called the gatekeepers of American democracy, because they are often the first people to greet a voter who has arrived on election day to exercise their right to vote. 117 poll workers make sure that people who vote can check in and provide ID in some states. They share important information about how to fill out ballots and make sure the voting process moves smoothly. Any place that serves as a polling station, in other words, a place to vote, needs poll workers. Most states provide training and payment for these important positions, but a lack of poll workers is an ongoing problem for many local jurisdictions. Nonprofit organizations, such as All Voting is Local, train and recruit poll workers to ensure fair election practices and to encourage all Americans to participate in their democracy. 118. The more we participate, the more we understand how politics impacts us. To find out more about being a poll worker, you can contact your state election board or read more at the U.S. Election Assistance Commission website. 119. Election regulations around the world. Election rules differ around the globe. In comparison to the United States, France imposes very strict regulations on how elections are run. In France, elections themselves are very brief, 2 weeks leading up to the casting of ballots and 1 week in between 2 separate ballots. And all media involving campaigns can only be aired during a 3-month run-up to an election. In addition, starting from the night before polls open, it is illegal to publish or in any way broadcast any type of communication that can be categorized as electoral propaganda. However, television stations can show candidates voting, along with other citizens, as long as all candidates in the election are included and provided no candidate transmits any sort of campaign message on camera. French law also prohibits the media from publishing, broadcasting, or commenting on any kind of electoral poll. Finally, election results, even partial ones, cannot be published or broadcast before the last polling place closes on Sunday. 120. The state also caps both campaign donations and expenditures. A special commission monitors campaign expenditures, and the state can reimburse up to 50% of certified elections. 121. In Britain, the Prime Minister can call an election at will. These are called snap elections. A Prime Minister might call a snap election on the back of good news, for example, in order to bolster his or her majority within the Parliament. Elections in the United Kingdom are also short compared to those in the United States. Tony Blair, the leader of the Labour Party, famously announced his candidacy for Prime Minister 1 month before the election. 122. Unlike the fixed election calendar America follows, the system in the United Kingdom is more flexible. Parliament is dissolved after 5 years and 25 days before a general election. However, as stated previously, these elections can be called at any time during a Prime Minister's term. Citizens in the United Kingdom vote for members of Parliament, MPs from their district, and the party with the most seats elects the Prime Minister from among their ranks. However, the Prime Minister is officially appointed by the Queen, though she typically follows the majority party's choice for who should fill the role. 123. A vote of no confidence, when the majority of the legislature indicates that they can no longer support the Prime Minister and their government, can make way for a new leader and governing body through a general election.